high-level bridge across the River Tyne has linked Newcastle on the north bank to Gateshead on the south since it was opened with pomp and ceremony by Queen Victoria in 1849. The two towns coexist in a partnership that maintains their separate identities while recognising their sisterhood, bonded by the river. Designed by the brilliant engineer Robert Stevenson, son of George, the high-level bridge was hailed as a modern marvel, carrying foot, carriage and rail passengers efficiently across the river. In the early hours of Friday the 6th of October 1854, just 5 years after it was opened, it served a new purpose, one that its creator could never have imagined. To those brave enough to venture upon it that night, it provided a grandstand view of the almost total destruction of the Newcastle and Gateshead quaysides as a mighty explosion and the resulting fires tore through the workplaces and communities that lived and worked on and near the river. When it was all over, 53 people would be dead, hundreds injured, and the area decimated. Today, the north and south sides of the River Tyne are a world away from the grimy and overcrowded scene we would have witnessed on Victorian Tyneside.
The bulk of Gateshead's population was still very much huddled around the quayside, and huddled was the right word because they were literally cheek by jowl. These houses and tenements, really cramped conditions and very poor living conditions, very unsanitary. Disease, there'd just been a cholera epidemic the previous year. It was not a nice place to live.
Rents would mop up most of their wages, so people were really quite poor. And when you look at records, you'll find that there were maybe 8, sometimes 10 people living in one room on the quayside. And there's no piped water, there's no sanitation. It was a recipe for disaster.
You know, they'd come to Gateshead as Irish and Scottish immigrants, many of them, to work on projects like the high-level bridge, and we're working in the iron industry, the glassworks, just general workmen. Anybody who had any money would get out of this area if they could.
Gone are the great warehouses, the back-to-back tenements, and the dirty industrial infrastructure that made the river work. No longer does the waterway bustle with sail and the emerging steamships that gave it such energy. No longer does it stink of the unmentionable waste that would have been discharged into it on a daily basis. In the 21st century, the banks of the River Tyne host cosy coffee shops, high art, and all the trappings of a modern metropolis. In 1854, both sides of the river were very much at work, feeding and being fed by the visiting vessels that loaded and unloaded repeatedly, the ships that took coal and other goods from Tyneside and brought the world home. The river was crowded and very much a place of business, and it was crossed by 2 bridges, Stevenson's new high-level bridge and an older, low-level bridge built in 1781 to replace its medieval predecessor that was spectacularly washed away during a great flood in 1771. In the wider world of 1854, the Crimean War was being fought, Charles Dickens' Hard Times was being published, and Oscar Wilde was born. On the Gateshead side of the river, just a few yards from where the newer Tyne Bridge that was completed in 1928 now stands, once stood the premises of a worsted manufacturer, Wilson & Sons. Wilson's would take in wool, treat it and turn it into worsted for onward shipment. The Wilson Company had met with adversity before 1854 when their original premises, built on the same site, had burnt to the ground. Ever cautious to the constant threat of fire, the Wilson management made every reasonable effort to prevent it. At close of business, all gas was shut off from a central point, and on the night in question, owner James Wilson's nephew John was sleeping on the premises. Despite these precautions, at about midnight on the 6th of October, while doing his rounds, policeman John Hewitt noticed that smoke and flame was coming from the building. After racing to Gateshead police station to raise the alarm, he returned with another officer to begin fighting the fire. After entering the building, the extent of the blaze became apparent. Joined by John Wilson, who'd been awoken by the commotion, they saw that it was the upper part of the mill that was on fire. Later, witnesses said that they had no doubt that it was gas that had caused the blaze, surmising that wool had fallen onto a light. However, at the inquest, the owners explained the process whereby the gas was turned off centrally and presented a number of witnesses who testified to the same. Firefighting in Victorian England was still an inexact science. Brigades had evolved from private companies employed by insurance agents to protect certain properties with the correct badge or fire mark. The equipment was still mostly either hand or horse-drawn, using pitiful hoses to propel water onto any blaze in the hope of success. Brave individuals would place themselves in great peril with little in the way of personal protection.
Now, when you're talking about sort of fire equipment, you're talking about horses in a cart with maybe a stirrup pump on. And Newcastle very kindly sent their fire equipment over to the Gateshead site to help try and, enclose this fire and put it out.
The cause of the original fire remains a mystery, and had it just resulted in a second loss for Messrs Wilson and Sons, it would probably become a very minor footnote in the history of Victorian Gateshead, listed among hundreds of other fires, both industrial and domestic, that were the scourge of any growing Victorian conurbation. On the Gateshead quayside, next to Wilson and Sons Mill, was Bertram's Bonded Warehouse, a storage place for all manner of goods that had been offloaded from ships on the Tyne, awaiting legal clearance before continuing their onward journey. The building was typical of many large Victorian warehouses that once lined the riverbank. This example nearby beautifully demonstrates the towering functionality of working 19th century architecture. At the time of the fire, Bertram's had ironically fallen under the control of the County Fire Office, and it was being used as a free warehouse for local merchants. In the early hours of the 6th of October 1854, the warehouse contained a significant quantity of sulphur and nitrate of soda, two of the ingredients required for making gunpowder, although despite accusations to the contrary, the warehouse stored no actual gunpowder itself.
The various things that are in the warehouse, what would they be used for? What would they be doing?
The majority of the materials here would have been used for manufacturing. There's a lot of metals in there. There's iron, which would have been used for building materials. Manganese is 75 tons of manganese, which is used to adulterate the iron to make it stronger. We've got a lot of iron salts there, which are used in pottery manufacturing and things like that. There's also an awful lot of sulphur and nitrate of soda, which after some of the processing would have been used for the manufacturing of gunpowder.
As the fire at Wilson's began to overwhelm the building, it inevitably began to spread to those nearby, including Bertram's warehouse. Reports stated that as the heat reached the building, the sulphur began to melt and burn, cascading out of the windows in rivers of blue flame, adding to the increasingly surreal scene. As the spectacle grew, so did its audience. People on both sides of the river clamoured to witness the inferno. Ships moored on the river thronged with men in their rigging. The old Tyne Bridge was awash with brave souls, and the new high-level bridge provided the ideal vantage point.
A disaster like this was really good entertainment. Crowds flocked to the quayside because the quayside was a good viewing place to watch the fire in Gateshead. People were crowding onto both bridges. Some people were climbing the masts of ships in the Tyne, and they were watching the fire.
By 3 o'clock in the morning, the decision had been made to abandon Wilson's to its fate. Those fighting the fire now concentrated their efforts on Bertram's. Alongside the firemen were brave locals and the army, who'd now arrived along with their own fire engine to fight the ever-increasing flames. Ensign Hastings Painter, an 18-year-old trainee officer in the 26th Cameronians, had only been with the army since July and probably thought that he would be off to the Crimea. Instead, his duty had taken him to the northeast of England, and on this particular morning, he and his men had been roused to fight the ever-increasing inferno in Gateshead. Measuring 80 feet by 20 and 7 stories high, the warehouse presented a formidable sight to those that had gathered to witness its fate. The stink of sulphur consumed the Tyne as smoke and flames rose ever higher. The contents of the building fueling the furnace. An account written shortly after stated that the sulphurous blaze illuminated the river and its shipping. The Tyne, the high-level bridge, the castle and the steeples of All Saints, St Nicholas's and St Mary's, and every other surrounding prominent object with its lurid purple light. From the various floors of the warehouse, the sulphur flowed in torrents like streams of lava, and the building resembled a cataract of fire.
Well, with nearly 3,000 tons of sulphur there, sulphur's got quite a low melting point compared to some of the other elements, 114 degrees Celsius. So as soon as the fire started, things started getting hot in the warehouse. It would have turned to this red liquid that would have flowed through the cracks in the walls, out of the building and poured out into the street. So this is some finely divided sulphur, or what would have been called flowers of sulphur. And at the moment it's a yellow powder, which is how it would have been processed. And what happens when we apply some heat to it is we're going to melt the sulphur. And once it gets up to that temperature of about 114 degrees, which is happening quite quickly here, we're going to get liquid sulphur. And here we have this mostly yellowy orange liquid, and in this the sulphur atoms are still bound to each other in a ring of 8. But if we keep heating them, these rings start to open up and the sulphur polymerizes into this deep red oil, which is what would have been pouring out of the windows. And with 2,800 tons of this molten, you have to think it would have been pouring out at quite a rate onto the quayside and into the Tyne. And here you can see we have a puddle of molten sulphur with that violet flame that was reported to have been seen all the way down the quayside. And this is what the sulphur would have looked like pouring out of the windows and running down the quayside and into the River Tyne. This deep red molten sulphur that's actually on fire is hitting the surface of the water, it's cooling down, and it's changing back into yellow cyclic sulphur that we saw previously. We do actually have some amorphous sulphur, which is rather like a jelly sweet.
But even though this was sort of 2-3 o'clock in the morning, this would have been a spectacle, and that's presumably why people started to gather on the bridges and the opposite quayside.
Yeah, even from the other side of the quayside, you would have been able to see this in full glory because of the glow of the sulphur as it burns. It's a blue-violet flame that would have lit up the whole side of the quayside.
Those watching the devastation thronged the Newcastle quayside and bridges, delighting in the show that lit up the river in such a spectacular fashion. Some fell victim to pickpockets who seized the opportunity as their prey was too engrossed to notice. Those fighting the fire, civilian, fire brigade and military, were relentless in their efforts to halt its devastation. Hour after hour they bravely worked together until the first sign of things yet to come occurred.
There are a couple of very small explosions. And sadly, this is the ticking time bomb. This is when people should have really moved, but they didn't.
Deep within the burning warehouse, the nature of the inferno changed as a yawning rumble was felt by those fighting and watching. A concussion that subsided as quickly as it occurred. They fought on. A second low growl shook the area, followed by a third. Deep booms from within that caused the quays to shake and the river to heave.
This, to modern ears, would have been a warning to get away, to be somewhere else. Obviously that wasn't the case at the time. Does that provide any clue as to what was going on, these preliminary explosions?
Well, there are a few circumstances here that could have led to smaller explosions that perhaps formed the larger explosion. We've got the molten sulphur there, you've got manganese, which could have decomposed water that was being piled onto this fire to try and put out what they thought was a normal fire. And this could have generated hydrogen. You could have had smaller explosions, punching holes in walls, and leading to air getting in and mixing with the sulfur and causing a much larger explosion than would otherwise have happened. When we've got very finely ground particles like dusts and they become aerosolized by a gust of wind into the path of a flame, they can actually cause the flame to flare up. And there were casks of cement dust there, among with other compounds that might have been present in a dusty form. And when these are introduced into the path of a flame, it's rather like a flower explosion that can happen in the presence of flower dust and static electricity. So what I can do here is if I introduce a dust into the flame, you can see the flare up that it causes. And what happens is the additional oxygen and the fuel is causing the flame to flare up. And this might have been the cause of one of the smaller explosions, which may have introduced flame into areas where perhaps the sulfur gases had built up, or maybe the hydrogen gas from the manganese.
Still, those warnings failed to deter the firefighters. Still, they drew buckets and trained their hoses on Bertram's warehouse until, as the eyewitness account continues, the vaults of the warehouse were burst open with a tremendous and terrific explosion. The strong masonry of the walls and the firm earth of their foundations were torn up as by the ploughshare of destruction. The air was rent as with the voice of many thunders and filled as with the spume of a volcano. The rocky basis of Tyneside trembled and the heaving river lifted the vessels on its bosom as if lashed to instant fury by some sudden storm. The Olden Bridge shook as if its firmly compacted stones, which time had knit together, would have parted from each other in the throes of an untimely dissolution. And the iron-bound high level, as it met the force of the convulsion, quivered on its lofty piers as in a mighty struggle for a prolonged existence. The venerable pile of the parish church was rent and shattered to a wreck, and the hands of the dial stood at 10 minutes past 3 o'clock to record, as it were, the time of this terrible catastrophe.
And of course, in the river, you had a lot of sailing boats. The sails were on fire. The noise of the explosion was heard down coal pits. You know, miners came to the surface thinking that something had happened to the pit. So it really was. It was like a volcano. That's the closest you can get to describing what it was like.
After this mighty explosion had ripped the heart out of the Tyneside quays, a moment of stunned silence followed, and all too tiny pause before burning rain and debris descended upon Newcastle and Gateshead, accompanied by the screams of the wounded and dying. The explosion that was heard miles out at sea and in towns as far away as Hartlepool to the south and Alnwick to the north had devastated the scene. Firefighters and onlookers, even those attempting to sleep in their beds, fell victim to either the explosion or its destructive after effects. Choking black smoke, accompanied by the stink of sulphur, hampered those that attempted to rescue the injured. Many trapped under wreckage. The burning debris spawned new fires across both Gateshead and Newcastle.
The quayside at that time was lit by gas lighting. They were all taken out, so it was pitch black, so you can imagine what it felt like. Hundreds of windows were blown out.
The call went out to surrounding towns for help and support. Firefighters arrived from Durham, Sunderland, Hexham, and as far away as Berwick on the Scottish border, rushing to the scene to help quell the new fires as well as the existing blaze, which centred on the 40-foot crater where the now shattered Bertram's warehouse once proudly stood. While the fires were fought, the injured were rescued and the dead retrieved. Those that survived the initial blast suffered appalling injuries, many of whom may have wished that they'd expired immediately. 39-year-old Richard Dodds suffered a fractured skull and extensive burns. Anna Ludlow, a 54-year-old tripe dealer, had to have her arm amputated following severe fractures. Both died later in the Gateshead dispensary. Broken bones, severe burns and crush injuries were the souvenirs of the lucky. Total oblivion, the fate of others. The fire claimed the high and lowborn with equal disdain. Peter May, a labourer. Thomas Sharp, listed as a gentleman who was so badly mangled that he could only be identified by his gold watch and whistles. The second son of the renowned Newcastle architect John Dobson, 26-year-old Alexander Dobson, similarly only identified by his keys. And Charles Bertram, the former owner of the warehouse that disappeared in such spectacular circumstances, all fell on the 6th of October 1854.
And he'd been a previous owner of the warehouse, had come down, had been asked to come down to sort of look at it and identify the safest areas where things could be moved to, where the best place to direct water to. But on his way, he met Gateshead's mayor, David Haggie, and offered Mr Haggie a pinch of snuff. And unfortunately, that was the last act that we know Charles Bertram did, because at that moment, there was the explosion. And Mr Haggie was blown underneath some fire equipment and emerged unscathed but very sooty. Of Mr Bertram's body, there was no trace, only his snuff box with the initials CB and a house key, and that was all that remained of Mr Bertram.
Young Ensign Painter also paid the ultimate price for doing his duty. In the official military report, his sergeant stated, "When we were taking the hose to put in the suction pipe, Mr Painter was there giving directions. We had broken the windows to get the pipe through. Just after that, the explosion took place. The ground was shaken and the place was darkened with dust and smoke. Mr Painter was afterwards found dead amongst the rubbish." In total, 53 people lost their lives, with an estimated further 500 injured. Accounts go on, Hillgate and St Mary's Church and all the streets around suffered considerably by the shock. Some, in their beds a considerable distance from the fire, were killed or injured by falling stones coming through roofs. Many rushed naked and shrieking into the streets and fled they knew not whither. A battlefield, a writer of the day told, could not have yielded a more horrible tragedy. Limbs were torn away, lumps of wood forced into the human body, stones buried in the flesh, burning sulphur around unconscious victims, and every conceivable injury inflicted on man, woman and child.
People were taken to the dispensary at Gateshead and to the Newcastle dispensary, and many subsequently died of their wounds. A lot of people died of shock, and a lot of people were simply buried under debris.
As early morning wore on, the firefighting and rescue efforts continued. Floating firefighting equipment was dispatched from South Shields further down the river and from Sunderland to the south. On the south bank in Gateshead, St Mary's Church was in ruins, as was the whole of Cannon Street and most of the surrounding area down to the river, including tenement houses, riverside yards and factories.
After the fire, St Mary's had no windows left. Every window was blown out. A lot of the gravestones were simply uprooted. It presented a very desolate appearance. It was so desolate that many people thought the church should just simply be demolished and rebuilt in another location. But people power prevailed. Gateshead people got behind the idea of this building remaining very firmly where it was.
On the north bank, the destruction was more widespread. The Newcastle Customs House had its roof blown off, and many properties alongside the river were either blown in by the explosion or injured by the raining debris.
Stones, brimstone shot from Gateshead over onto the Newcastle bank of the river. Lots of people were injured. The burning debris landed on some of the buildings and they took fire. The fire started about where Side is and it went as far as Butcher Bank. Hundreds of windows were blown out and then a calm descended over the quayside.
A general account of the damage stated, large blocks of wood and stone were projected considerable distances across the river. One stone was embedded in a house left standing at the west end of the quay. A stone was dashed with such violence as actually to penetrate like a bullet through the wall of the engine house of the Courant office on Pilgrim Street. A stone weighing 18 pounds fell through the roof of the premises of Mr. Hewitson, optician of Grey Street. It broke a beam in its descent and embedded itself in the workshop floor. When the workmen came in the morning, it was still too hot to be handled. A huge beam of timber about 6 feet long was hurled upon the roof of All Saints Church. Another piece about 10 feet long was thrown upon the Ridley Arms Inn in Pilgrim Street, and another upon the roof of a house in Mosley Street.
Within this destruction, there were accounts of remarkable survival. A family consisting of a husband, wife and 8 children who occupied an attic in the Church Walk area of Gateshead had all gathered at the window to watch the flames. When the explosion occurred, some heavy stones were hurled upon the house, breaking down the roof and forcing their way into the attic in which they were assembled. One large stone fell upon the bed where the children had been lying a quarter of an hour before. With the exception of a few light scratches, not one was injured. This story of deliverance contrasts sharply with that of the Hart family, also of Church Walk in Gateshead. Samuel Hart, his wife Mary, their 15-year-old son John, and 8-year-old niece all perished.
The next day there were emergency meetings of both councils. In the middle of the Gateshead council meeting, a gentleman burst in and said another fire had broken out on the Newcastle side, and everybody instantly left and proceeded to the scene. So there was a state, you know, for 2 days people really didn't know what to do. Nothing like this had ever happened before, but both towns worked together.
The fires on both sides of the river continued to rage, and it wasn't until the next day that, after deliberately blowing up further property to create a firebreak, that the situation was finally brought under control and the true extent of the damage on both sides of the river could be surveyed. As word of the Great Fire spread, spectators from around the region and beyond travelled to Tyneside to witness the extent of the devastation. In their misery, the towns of Newcastle and Gateshead accommodated an estimated 20,000 apocalypse tourists from across the country, with extra trains laid on for the purpose.
Two inquests followed the Great Fire of 1854, one in Newcastle and one in Gateshead. The findings were inconclusive. No one was sure how the original fire in Wilson's Mill began. Witnesses testified that precautions were taken to prevent fire, and they confirmed that the gas had been turned off. The accusation that Bertram's warehouse contained gunpowder proved unfounded. Despite a reward being offered for specific information, none was forthcoming. And although 2 of the ingredients for gunpowder were stored, sulphur and nitrate of soda, the actual cause remained inconclusive.
They tested the residues that were found around Gateshead and Newcastle and didn't discover any of the potassium salts. They only discovered the nitrate of soda salt, so that the sodium sulfate that was produced as a result of the explosion.
So with these ingredients, as a chemist, having looked at the report of the time, the enormous explosion that destroyed the warehouse, wiped out the Gateshead quayside, destroyed a large proportion of the Newcastle quayside, hurled debris across the river, was heard in Alnwick, was heard in Hartlepool, out to sea and down the mines. With these ingredients, what do you think caused the ultimate explosion?
Well, can't be definitive on it, but with the massive amounts of sulfur that are involved, once that's molten, it boils at 445 degrees C, it will turn into a vapor. You generate an enormous amount of vapor in a very small space. If one of these smaller explosions had punched a hole in the wall and allowed the flames to get at that sulfur vapor, introduce some oxygen, you could have had an enormous explosion, and that could have been the cause of the ultimate explosion.
The actual cause remains inconclusive.
A benevolent fund for the victims was set up and its coffers quickly swelled, aided by Queen Victoria, who stopped off for luncheon at Newcastle on her way back from Balmoral a few days after the fire, pledging £100. Local nobility, charities from across the country, and the ordinary men and women who empathised with the victims of Tyneside all gave assistance.
You could apply to the relief fund and £50 per family were dished out to the families, and you know, sometimes the families were better off after the fire than they were before the fire.
Money was even forthcoming from a collection at St John's Presbyterian Church in nearby South Shields, which is curious, seeing as Reverend Story took the opportunity to preach his verdict on the cause of the explosion, titled God's Judgment on an Ungodly City, during which he sermonised that as a community, the town of Gateshead worships no God. Like most cataclysms, the events of the 6th of October 1854 have faded in time. The fire has become part of Tyneside folklore, and as the Newcastle and Gateshead quaysides were repaired and have evolved over the years, the evidence of that night has all but disappeared. But in cemeteries on both sides of the river, those that lost their lives rest, maintaining a silent vigil marking the cost of the Great Fire.